Okay. Wickham, this is for you. Wickham is one of only two suburbs of Newcastle on the south side of the Tyne. It stands at the top of a very steep hill, known and feared, called Wickham Bank. So severe is the slope, they had to integrate it as unable to cope. Yet you have to go far, far back into history to find the best story of the area. The northern part of Britain was once ruled by the Danes, and they had ravaged across the land, setting up home and eventually breeding with the indigenous population. Yet one major massacre took place long before that, when Viking longships were raiding the northeast coast. They were after three things: obviously gold and riches, but also women to use as slaves or concubines. But also women to use as slaves or concubines, and later as wives, and also livestock to breed and farm. Now, it is sad that few people ever mention this horrific episode, and yet I will be happy to show you how it was lost in the dusty shelves of time. On the 16th of June, 793, a number of longboats docked in Portland Bay on the island of Lindisfarne, and they attacked and pillaged the Christian Abbey. For years, the priests there had lived a good life with slaves to do all the manual work, and women who were charged with cooking, cleaning, and having sex with the priests. They were rich and powerful men, although they always described themselves in the holy writings of the day as pious, humble, and poor. Yet as that was the only writing of the day, who was there to question the lie that they painted? Many of the non-religious Northumbrians all knew how hypocritical these priests were, and they were actually pleased when the Vikings cleaned out the abbey. Yes, they were terrified of the Norsemen too, but at last, for once, the two-faced priests were getting sorted out. All of that money that Northumbrians paid into the church had gone to feeding these fat, spoiled priests and giving them the sort of power that no ordinary man could ever have dreamed of. Two of the priests were skinned alive from head to toe, and their skin was folded up into a square and nailed to the abbey door. Whilst still alive and screaming in agony, these overstuffed men were hurled into the salty water, where they died instantly of shock. A leading religious writer of the time, Alcuin of York, wrote, "Never before has such an atrocity been seen." Relatively few people died, but they were Christians. Not only that, they were priests belonging to the church, so the church was appalled and painted this attack as one of the worst atrocities on British soil. Yet 3 days later, 6 longships sailed up the River Tyne and docked just past the main Swalwell dock. Yet thanks to a wooden watchtower, they were spotted, and the few villagers living on the bank of the river had time to grab their animals and race into the heavily wooded hills. This meant there was very little for these Scandinavians to take, and yet they could smell food. And high up the hill that faced them, there was a strange white glow in the sky. They knew that that meant another village. It seemed a long way from their vessels, but they had to take the chance before travelling back across the North Sea. The village stood where the very top of Wickham Bank now stands, and housed around 50 men, women and children. Well, the Vikings were well armed, but wore little armour, so they could manage to scuttle up a tiny track opened up by those Wickham villagers to allow them to get down to the river to fish and hunt. But on getting up to the village, they were surprised when the villagers didn't run, they didn't reach for their weapons. Instead, they offered food to their would-be attackers. This took the wind out of the sails of the Vikings, and despite being in the mood to murder, they found themselves feasting on goat and suckling pig. And by the end of the night, they were all heartily drunk and had decided to get a night's rest and rob their kind hosts the following morning. The village elder, believed to be a man called Loga, awoke halfway through the night and roused both men alike. And as the Vikings slept, the villagers ordered each man or woman to dispatch one attacker each. Now, there's various stories of how they achieved this, ranging from setting them all on fire using pitch oil and beheading them with axes. Yet the one that gets told the most involves a very simple gardening tool. Each villager stood above a Viking and at a predetermined moment placed a piece of wood, a knife, a blade or an axe on their throat. And then, when the moment was right, they all stamped down, shattering or cutting their throats. Other throats were cut. In some cases, small children were told to smash a sharp stone into their eyes. Those villagers who'd managed to kill their victims straight away raced over to Vikings who had merely been mutilated, swarming over them to finish them off. The only thread that persists through all of the stories is that they dragged the bodies to a cliff edge, poured pitch on them, lit it, and using long sticks, rolled them over the cliff as they landed not far from the Viking ships. This must have made the few remaining Scandinavians very unsettled, as none of them ventured up the hill. Instead, they got aboard their craft and sailed away. The village at Wickham, despite being very close to a river, the Tyne, regularly used by the Vikings, was never attacked and never taken. At the point on the road where the emergency escape lane is on Wickham Bank, there was said to be the murder of a Norman knight. Not long after William the Conqueror took charge of Britain, he sent his knights across the country to establish control. One such knight, called Hubert of Saxony, disappeared somewhere in the North Country. There is a legend, though, from this area about a French knight who had demanded that a group of northerners leave their village on a high mountain promontory, believed to be Wickham. He was planning to erect a castle and a gate to control those who travelled through what was going to be his land. Yet the Wickham villagers were less than happy having to move from their farms and small holdings. So they agreed to meet the knights at a junction on the hill where the escape lane now stands. And there he and 4 fully armed knights readied themselves to accept the surrender of the land from a group of scruffy, unarmed peasants. Yet, instead, hundreds of arrows were suddenly fired at them. Rocks rained down from the opposite side of the road's edge. One huge boulder landed on the horse's head, killing it instantly and crashing Sir Hubert to the ground. The other knights dismounted to try and protect their fallen comrade. This was to no avail, as most had been hit by these primitive arrows. One man resembled a porcupine, and then slowly they fell to their knees, only for the villagers to fall on them, hacking them to pieces with farming tools. The bodies of the men and horses are said to be buried on that spot. Some villagers told of how, on cold nights, you can see the warm spirits of the dead leaving their graves and seeking the poorly body of a sick person to take it over and to possess it. There were many stories of possession, men stolen from their sick bed and made miraculously healthy again. In some cases, too healthy, trying to leap distances that were too great. On one occasion, Lionel Samuel of Wickham, who had been close to death until he was taken over by something. He tried to leap off a roof on a row of terraced houses at the top of Wickham Bank. And he landed so badly that both his legs snapped and burst through the skin, and he bled to death before he could be helped. In 1899, Celia Davison of Wickham went into a coma after catching pneumonia and